really which version of the framework. If we're talking about what's enabled or fixed or whatever else, we're not going to be looking at fixes mainly from the libraries too. So that's something else to think about. I mean,
Yep.
There's very little that would involve us from, correct me if I'm wrong, from UIA related standpoint from the framework itself from the libraries.
Agreed. They'll care about which edition of WinForms or WPF they're looking at.
It's an important semantic thing I wanted to point out.
So who's on the hook for?
I like when we.
I think the next step. I mean, I think from our point of view, I don't really care how you're doing it. So I think you don't need our approval for any of that. I don't know what we do normally for app compat switches, but also I assume I don't think it's called app compat, right? It's called app context, I think is the name. But yeah, whatever the
files, which have very similar scenarios usage because they both annotate methods that are problematic. One when it's streaming, the other one when it's single file. And although the behavior is similar, their syntactic usage is different, and that can be represented in the second block of requires assembly files. In the runtime, we still heavily use the message string, and instead we use a help URI that is embedded in the analyzer descriptor to provide some more information about the attribute. So the actual URL field in requires assembly files is not used.
So my take here is that requires assembly files has a decent message by default. Like if you don't put in a message, the tooling gives you a decent message saying, what about this method setter? So basically the proposed API. Well, the proposed API here with the first line not read.
So typically we don't have two public constructors for an attribute.
We always say like why this API needs assembly files. A third-party library who like they happen to be calling assembly.location or whatever, and so then they just want to slap on my API requires assembly files because I'm calling assembly location.
Message is good enough. I'm just slapping the thing on here. It marked a thing for the tool. Then I would just leave it as it is.
This almost reminds me exactly of the logger message define attribute with like the name we were having a couple weeks ago. I think we decided just to leave it as a property.
We have a reason, or if it's just habit.
I mean, we do have it for obsolete, right? Where you can, but it's basically is constructor with no arguments and a constructor with one argument.
I mean, it does. In this case, it kind of does feel like obsolete, right? Like you can just slap obsolete on an API, and it's pretty obvious what it means, right? It's like this API is obsolete, but
No.
Yeah. So the guidelines that we have are required property values should be constructor parameters, optionals should be settable, and do not have a constructor parameter for an optional argument. It is a do not. As you have pointed out,
The world hasn't ended.
Sure, but in this case, it's you can specify a message or the default one will be provided for you. It's not really changing the behavior of the attribute, so
Right.
it's probably the reason that this one's a void instead of do not.
Right. No,
But
I
this
think
is
I think this one
Christoph
is
era.
Yeah,
can't just ask to justify it.
yeah, that's fair. A constructor, or is it an optional parameter? In which case, no constructor overload should take it.
Yep. And then the other thing is about a third of the important attributes are interpreted by things that are looking at the IL, and it's don't make them have to look at two different.
I mean, I think honestly, this is such a common pattern that I'm honestly like of the opinion we should just make the changes proposed. I would just not delete the other overload.
Yeah, so overload the constructor, leave the property get only,
Yeah.
and it's default or with custom message. Yeah, that's
Apparently my dictionary
Okay.
does not contain the word parameterless. So we are okay with that shape then? I assume the attribute is sealed, right? If not, we should seal it.
Yeah, it already is.
I see the word sealed on screen.
Well, yeah, I put it there, but
Name to distributed context propagator. We discussed briefly in the API review whether we want more control in the HTTP client stack, other than just the global default. We decided that we do, so we're proposing exposing a property on sockets HTTP handler to let you control that. The name we came up with for sockets HTTP handler, yes.
I mean that seems fine. I'm not sure that it matters, but I mean I mean the only thing you need to be careful, I think, is that if there's ever another way of doing it, then it would be unfortunate if you say activity headers, but now you're doing something with.
It's kind of in a similar group of all the other APIs we only exposed on sockets HTTP handler instead of adding everything to HTTP client handler as well.
Yeah, I guess the question is like, is everybody who is, I mean, most of the time people don't instantiate a handler at all, right? They just new up HTTP client, right? And then there's some people who actually
Be all of them. It's just that socket HTTP handler would be the only one where we see the need to have it actually configurable at this level.
Interesting. I mean, technically, it wouldn't be a breaking change to add it to the base type later. So, I mean, I'm fine with that. But, yeah, I mean, to be honest, I never quite understood.
Basically just has like two abstract methods, right? Like send and send basic.
Well, there's
Yeah,
a base
method
type,
there.
and then there's a thing in between, right?
Because
I don't think
like
so.
people are supposed to create like default handler or something, right? Like there's I need to set a property on the handler that's not on.
Would be used commonly enough. But as you said, we can decide in the future that to add it there as well.
I see. Yeah, I mean, then that's the way we have things, and I guess that's the way we would expose it. I mean, I have to be honest, I actually like the name activity headers propagator. It's kind of sad that that's not the type name. But I guess the type name doesn't want to prescribe how it's being done.
Yeah, the problem with the type is that it's not specific to headers and not specific to activity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unless anybody has any concerns, that seems like a good thing as proposed. And by default, it's null, which means what?
By default, it will be the default. So the global distributed context propagator, the current. We may choose to change that. Right now, with the working
So
idea
would it
is
be
default.
null then, or would it just be when you new up a socket HTTP handler, that's what the thing is initialized to?
Currently, it would be initialized to the global current.
So then,
So is it nullable because setting it to null just turns off propagation instead
Yes.
of assigning it to the no op propagator?
Yes, setting to null really turns it off entirely. So you don't even get the
Gotcha.
diagnostics listener events.
that makes sense to me. That's what that's why I asked like what null means. If null means use default, then that would be weird. If null means it's off, then it makes sense to me.
Good with me.
All right, then this is it.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. So then, unbelievably, we're actually done with the red stuff. And now I just opened the wrong one, so I actually have some time left to walk the backlog. Can anybody talk to this one?
Sure. This counts here. We got a request to basically add the optional name that can be provided to some of the various derived weight handle types. That's provided to the constructor, just to surface it on as a property. I thought it got edited. I thought the proposal got edited. Is there an update from count somewhere below? Yeah.
Oh, so it's moved to weight handle, I see.
And just a getter. So basically it's just whatever was provided to the constructor gets returned here, effectively.
Sounds good to me.
So weight handles constructor doesn't take a name though. How do you set it?
Oh, it's abstract. So there are things like event weight handle, which derives from weight handle.
So would this property then be abstract instead?
No, it would just return null if the name wasn't provided.
Yeah, I guess my question is if the constructor of weight handle doesn't take it, how would the derived type initialize the name property?
The same way it does today, which I believe is internal. Hold on.
Oh, I see. I
I have to double check. Hold on.
Internal magic.
Oh, maybe it's actually. Hold on. Trying to bring up the source. That's actually a good question. I thought it was calling an internal constructor, but it's not. Actually, probably can't technically make it abstract. You'd have to make it virtual.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Any reason to go with like internal versus a protected constructor? It's just that like all the real implementations are internal.
Honestly, I think any of those would be fine.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So then let's just do this. So can I just push it back then as API needs work? So just make a decision which way, or should we just approve it as any of these things are fine?
I think it's fine. Any of these.
You are effectively required to specify additional parameters for them to work as expected. For bival array in particular, you need to specify size const.
Gotcha.
I don't think this is the only entry that needs to have an analyzer for it, though.
Decide if they all want the same severity level.
In this case, the doc says size const must be specified, whereas other fields like array subtype can optionally be specified.
Yeah, I guess my question is like if it's enabled by default and the code today works, except it's not performant, then enabled by default might be noisy because people already have it everywhere, right?
Indeed. It's just, yeah, if we know, I guess the future ones will be, if it's the same level of importance, it can reuse the same diagnostic ID with a placeholder, and if it's not, then it would be a different diagnostic ID, so it has a different on by default and severity.
In particular, for size const, bival t string is the other one that you have to specify the size constant because it's by value.
Fair enough. So those two should probably be done at the same time.
Yeah, and then there's ones like LP array where you have to do either size const or size param index.
Yeah, it sounds like a different message, so it's probably a different ID.
Yeah, otherwise, I mean, I'm okay with approving this as proposed. With the additional wrinkle that, you know, the default basically.
I think it should do both bival array and whatever the other one Tanner said at the same time.
Yeah, bival T straight T str.
Sorry, which one is that? Bival. Oh.
Yeah, so there's unmanaged type, or sorry, there's bival array and bival T str for string. I'll just post it in chat.
That would be sweet.
But yeah, both of those are effectively the same. It's just the T string is characters, and it picks ASCII versus UTF-16 based on or.
Was that read right?
That.
Yeah, I feel like bival tster would be the same diagnostic ID because it's the same size const is required. So it would just be that's probably not worth the code it would take to do it.
Right.
You'd have 2 billion fixers, one for each value.
I mean, is it only 2, or will it treat a negative number as an unsigned int?
That's a good point. All right, 4 billion then. All the argument exceptions at a minimum, and maybe some other exception types, have a static throw method or static throw overload, basically one for each constructor. The idea being that rather than just constructing an instance, it would also throw that instance. That's sort of the original proposal from Martin. I suggested we constrain it to just being for argument null exception, in particular because there's only one thing it's checking for, and it can easily, do the check for you. So rather than having to write if condition and then call argument null exception throw, you can just call argument null exception throw and pass in the argument name. You can imagine doing something similar for the other argument exceptions as well, but it becomes more complicated there. Because now, there's sort of an infinite number of conditions for an out of range exception that you can imagine. I'd also proposed doing this as something that the C# compiler could then target for its null checking feature that may or may not make it into C# 10, but if not C# 10, almost certainly C# 11, which is you can say, parameter bang bang, and it'll inject the check for you. And the original idea was that its injected check could simply be to call this method. However, after lots of discussion of all the various possibilities, the current plan is actually that it's just going to inject a helper, almost this exact helper, into every assembly that needs it. The reason being that for R to R code, this check would not end up getting inlined. Because it would be cross-version from whatever the assembly was into corelib. And so it could actually, for anyone relying on R to R and not using tiered compilation, it could actually be a de-optimization for the compiler to end up using this method rather than one that was in the same assembly. So this argument null exception helper would purely be sort of back in the original spirit of what Martin provided, not something the compiler would use, but at least not for the foreseeable future, just something to help a developer clean up their code a little bit if they wanted to.
That R to R issue seems like it could be fixed by specially handling this API.
You couldn't use the check in the place the compiler would insert it.
Or from other languages like F#, VB.
Sure.
Yeah, who cares about those?
Well, I mean, there's also, the bang bang can't respect. I know that if you're going to get an argument exception, it really doesn't matter what happens when they're aligned, but we usually check them left to right in declaration order. So a bang bang on the last thing, if the compiler is injecting it, it's going to go before all your custom code that did range validation.
That's true.
So
Although
people who care about such things just won't use bang bang.
Not always the case, but generally the things that are being null checked come earlier in the list rather than later. Not always true, but it's often the case. So there are various things to consider here. Would we want something specific to argument null exception? Would we want something for, do we care about saving just the throw in the IL versus the more complicated thing? If do it on all the argument exceptions or all exceptions in general. And for the latter, it certainly hasn't been designed.
Right. So let's assume that there's a method that the only throw statement in it is throw argument null exception. I know that in a lot of the
if you're tier 0 or doing debug, then it may result in potentially worse code gen, and it may cause the JIT to not be able to do some basic flow analysis it might otherwise be able to do in debug programs, and also have the kind of throw if or throw for type methods that also do argument validation in places. And I've got them for standard patterns like not zero, null, negative, and things like that. I would hope that C# could ultimately use this, and so it would just be a central API, and that there would be no ultimate issue with marking this as a non-versionable API, much like we do with most of math and other core functions.
Sure.
But I think that's a question for Jan, and if Jan would say yes, then it's a no-brainer to expose it, because then C# doesn't have to emit a stub in every single assembly.
And especially if someone wants to check it in the next 45 minutes. So that
we've got 2 more days now.
Oh, noon became noon on Thursday?
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, if we approved it, I'll just go do it, because it's like 2 lines of code and 4 lines of test code or something.
Right, and so then if it's in 6 instead of 7, then it probably has increased utility, and we can figure out what we need to do to make ready to run happy. So I say do it.
Yeah, I'd say the same. Another question on my end though is for .NET 7 in particular, and with the advent of exception, but more generally applicable to all exceptions via a small core type.
Maybe, I don't know that we just want to replace, throw new argument null exception with throw argument null exception dot create, right? Or sorry, I guess argument null exception dot throw, and then that replaces the parameters with the invokes the constructor and throws it like that. That feels weird. We have throw as a keyword. It means things.
Right.
Also, I feel that there's some attributes we want on this for the flow state.
Yeah.
Does not return if something.
But for you, my general point was that for applications and scenarios that do use throw helpers, they tend to use them extensively, and so therefore they do end up doing things like some class dot throw blah. And if there was a pattern to make that simple, then we can non-expensively support them without necessarily having to go modify all of our own types.
Fair.
Like the keyboard does exist, and that's the default pattern, and we likely want to encourage users to continue following that pattern for normal code. But for the users who do, like this one specifically tagged size reduction, because if you look at our own libraries, every single one of our libraries has throw helpers internally, sometimes duplicated from assembly to assembly, specifically for doing things like throw if null. And then you also explode that out to ASP.NET and other libraries that are performance oriented or care about this for those scenarios. And so that's a lot of duplicated code in the long run.
Yep.
Does this capture what we discussed?
No.
What?
You mean augmenting the existing rule we have to also recognize that this is a stand-in for the pattern we're currently detecting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you could pass to this, throw if null foo.bar, and then the caller argument expression will capture the string foo.bar, and it will throw a thing that kind of makes sense but isn't actually a parameter name, so you're not getting a good mapping. So the ideal call of this is just throw if null foo.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be fine to update our analyzer to warn in the same situations we would currently warn if you weren't using this helper.
Yeah.
So that's this API, and then there's the broader question of the original proposal, like, do we want just .throw methods on all the various exception types? My personal opinion is no, but I could be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, so for me, there would be some utility on some things like argument out of range exception for having throws that better use the standard strings, right? So we have, like, in all of our assemblies, we copy the resource for non-negative value, etc. And so if we
agree.
do a good,
yeah,
if we say, like, throw argument out of range exception, throw positive required, or like whatever, then now A, we've clarified that argument out of range exception is where we want that everywhere, and B, that that now everywhere gets the same message, and we can stop the duplication in all of our resource.
I agree. That would be an interesting thing for somebody to go and design out. It would probably entail reviewing where do we, what do we really use everywhere, and what do others really use everywhere, and what would that set of methods look like?
Yeah. So I like that line of thinking. I don't know that we just want to have a general pattern of always having the throw personally, but if somebody wants to make an argument from eliminating many cases of throw helpers and other type things, then I'll shrug.
I'm not an engineer hat. It feels like we're increasing the scope just because they gave us more rope.
Well,
increasing the scope to include what?
Like if the snap was in 30 minutes, right?
No, let's not discuss that as part of API review.
Okay.
The compile feature, that's not how I see it. In fact, like we're only going to go through .NET runtime once, changing our 7,000 something like that, if null throw. I'm not going to go through and change all of them to use argument null exception throw if null. We'll wait for the language feature to do that. This will end up being used.
But speaking of, now that we have more runway, I marked an obsolescence proposal for 6.
Actually, let me change the milestone here on this guy then, just so we are clear. All right, which one did you just flip? This one here, obsolete.
Yep. All right, so crypto config, which is one of my least favorite types, has a method called encode OID, which given an OID string returns the byte array that represents that OID. If you give it a string that is in the range of things that it does correctly and is valid, then it will give you a right answer. But it supports a whole lot of wrong answers that it returns, like things that are nonsense that it returns answers for. It also doesn't correctly handle all legal inputs. And when we looked at can we reconcile these things to make it produce right